task force and its working groups bring together people with lived experience. Welsh Government policy leads, some are here today, representative organisations, identifying the issues and barriers that affect the lives of many.
Well, welcome to Glamorgan County Cricket Club this morning for a special edition of In the Spotlight with Lee Ellery, brought to you by Swan TV. Today I'm going to be covering the Disability Wales Annual Conference, which is talking about the portrayal of disabled people within the media. And my first guest today is the Minister for Social Justice and Social Justice with responsibility for equalities within the Welsh Government, Jane Hutt, who I've had the pleasure of working with now for many years on the Disability Rights Task Force. So welcome, Jane. Can you tell me a bit about the Disability Rights Task Force and how it came about?
Well, thank you very much, Lee, and I'm really pleased to be here with you today, and particularly also to be here for the Disability Wales conference, and it's really good that it's got a spotlight on portrayal in the media. There's been a lot of work on that, but just importantly for our conversation this morning, this is about, as you say, what are we doing with the Disability Rights Task Force? How is it going? Where's it started? How did it come about? And so I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to explain a bit of the history. And actually, the history does go back to the pandemic in terms of this particular task force, doesn't it,
yeah.
Lee? Because we had such a terrible impact on disabled people, the pandemic. And I remember we had the Disability Equality Forum, which has been going for years, which I chair and you sit on. Working through the pandemic, we used to look at all of the issues in terms of the impact of the COVID-19, the impact of restrictions and the protection of and the needs and interests and rights of disabled people. We looked at that in the Disability Equality Forum. But then we thought disabled people in the forum said we need to have some research done on the impact of pandemic. So that research came out with a report called Locked Out.
Yeah.
Wasn't it important?
Remember it very well.
Liberating disabled people. And the thought was, and the response from government, and it included Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, was that we needed a Disability Rights Task Force, which would be co-chaired by myself and by Professor Debbie Foster, and that it would have people with lived experience, disabled people, actually running the work streams, the working parties that were going to working groups that were going to be set up. And that's the story. I mean, actually, I remember it was 2021 when we got together, because it was just before an election, a Senate election. We had to get it out before that election, and when we got going with it.
We were really short on time, I remember, because the election was coming up and we wanted to get it out, and we were keen to get the government's response. But on the upside, Jane, how do you see the work progressing now as we are now, and where do you see it going in the future?
Well, it was very important that we looked at the report on the impact of coronavirus on disabled people, and looked at this in terms of exposing, if you like, or exposing and reminding, and new evidence of the inequalities faced by disabled people in Wales. And I recall way back in 2002, I was the Minister for Health and Social Services, making a statement in what was then called the Assembly, committing ourselves to adopting the social model of disability.
I remember it well.
Well, gosh, we do go back, don't we? So, I mean, that was the 2 points that underpinned our work and have done, you know, and we can, I'm sure, just look at the working groups that have been set up and running, was social model of disability had to underpin everything.
Yeah.
And also co-production, so that it wasn't people like myself, politicians, or indeed people, officials we employ, civil servants. We needed to work and co-produce the way forward, implement the recommendations that were coming from that report. So I think that was one of I remember the first meeting of the Disability Rights Task Force. We committed ourselves to seeing social model of disability influencing everything, and knew we had a long way to go. Many people still haven't grasped this, have they?
No, and I think it goes back to the grassroots. I think everyone needs to know the social model of disability. Like throughout, it goes. We've been talking about it for a while. It goes back to the education of young people. It goes back to the training that they get in schools. If they're not trained, then how are they supposed to know?
Well, absolutely, and it's one of the things about the Disability Rights Task Force is that it has to influence every part of government. So it has to influence education, as you say, what happens in our schools, the curriculum. It has to influence housing, economy, leisure, media, social health and social care. People think that's the big thing. Well, of course it is very big, but it's not the only area of policy. So transport, that's why we've got a travel working group, as well as independent living and health working group. It's also why we've got an employment and income working group, a children and young people working group, an affordable and accessible housing working group. And interestingly now, as you know, more recently, recognition that there are issues relating to justice.
Yeah.
That we need to, so that's sort of come out in the last few months, hasn't it?
I think with the task force, it's always evolving. We think we think we've done enough, and then something else crops up, and we have to work on that. But going into the future, as someone who sits on the task force, my fear is that after the work is done, and I know John has been on some calls with us talking about this as well. After the report has been done, is there any talk in government at the moment whether we can continue using the task force in a different way?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I haven't spoken to John about this. John is our specialist advisor. But I think what's important is that these working groups, I've mentioned the names of them, some of them have already concluded their work. And every time they've concluded their work, like on the Independent Health Working Group, the Minister for Health and Social Services has come to the task force, received the report, responded to it. The Deputy Climate Change Minister has come to the Travel Working Group, which is, of course, led by Andrea Gordon from Guide Dogs for the Blind. And also, we would expect the Deputy Minister for Social Services, I'm sure, will be coming to the Children and Young People Working Group. This must be owned. It's owned by the disabled people who are like yourself, Lee, who are running the task force. But it must be owned by the ministers. Yeah. It must be owned by their officials. They've got to go and implement. The point is, it's about implementation. Yeah. And funnily enough, this is something where we had the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. We produced the report. Then we set up an accountability group. And what's more, it was an external accountability group. So it was people outside of the Welsh Government looking to see, are you implementing this? And I think we can learn from that we need the same sort of thing, an accountability group, regular reporting, how are you implementing these recommendations from the Disability Task Force? I mean, we may look at the Disability Equality Forum, we still have a Race Equality Forum, as one of the monitoring groups of this. Yeah. We may have to look at whether we want a wider external accountability group. But I think the lessons have been learnt that you can have plans, and indeed, I mean, back in 2019, we did have our plan for independent living. You may have been there in Bridgend when I launched that plan. I remember it well, but it was across government. There was actions for every part of government, but it obviously needed to be completely refreshed and strengthened.
Yeah.
And you have to have the ownership of the whole government. And I wouldn't say just Welsh Government, because on the task force we do have people from local government, don't we? The Welsh Local Government Association, we do have people from the health service as well.
Yeah, and I think it's just testament to how far we've come. Having all them people committed to all of our work says that we must be doing something right. And I know that today is going to be a good day as well to try and see whether we can pick up anything to take back to the task force, especially for me anyway. So thank you for joining me today, Jane. I look forward to your speech a bit later on today.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much, Lee.
Thank you for joining me for this interview with the Minister. There'll be more a bit later on today.